The Soldier's Return. Ryan Lewis gripped the wheel of his worn truck, his knuckles turning pale as he navigated through the twisting back roads of his hometown. The fading daylight cast long shadows across the familiar landscape, stretching over golden fields and sleepy homes. It should have been a comforting sight, one that would make any soldier feel he'd finally reached sanctuary. But tonight, the colors that once felt warm now seemed muted, as if the memories associated with them had been dulled by too many sleepless nights, too many years away, and too many broken promises. As he drove past the old Miller farm, its weathered barn standing proudly against the backdrop of open fields, a wave of memories washed over him. Once, this route would have been his path to peace after grueling training days. He would drive these roads, his heart light with the knowledge that his wife and daughter waited for him at the end of the line. Now, with every mile closer, an unsettling weight gathered in his chest. Lily. The last time he'd seen her was a bittersweet memory he held close. She had been so small then, standing beside him at the base, her fingers clinging tightly to his uniform. Her eyes, filled with questions, had searched his face for reassurances he barely felt qualified to give. "Promise you'll come back, Dad," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the airfield. "Always, sweetheart." He had smiled, trying to keep the shadows of worry from his face. Her hopeful, innocent gaze had made him believe he could indeed keep that promise, that his return would be met with open arms and a continuation of their quiet, joyful life. But life had unraveled in his absence. The images that came next in his mind were sharper, darker. His heart clenched as he recalled the long-distance phone call that had revealed his wife Sarah's betrayal. One night, after an exhausting mission, he had opened her message, one that was never meant for him, confirming that she'd moved on with someone else, someone he'd once called a friend. The sensation had been like a physical wound, the kind of pain that hollowed out his chest and left him fighting for breath. He had faced it the only way he knew how, with strength and stoicism. The pain had been buried under layers of duty and responsibility. And as if her betrayal wasn't enough, her choice to move on so swiftly, to move in with her new partner, taking Lily with her, had been an added stab. He had fought battles overseas, but this was a kind of warfare he hadn't prepared for. The last few years had been a relentless struggle to maintain his bond with Lily. There had been endless legal battles, each one casting him as the outsider, the dangerous stranger, despite years of faithful service to his country and family. The court had ruled in favor of Sarah, limiting his visits and framing him as a distant, sporadic figure in his daughter's life. And with each passing year, his relationship with Lily became more tenuous, reduced to fleeting video calls and letters that left him feeling more like a pen pal than a father. As he drove into Cedar Grove, the town's welcome sign stood resolute, but its cheery message of "where family comes first" felt like a bitter irony. Cedar Grove had once represented everything Ryan had loved: family, friendship, home. Now, it only reminded him of the fragments of the life he'd lost. Finally, his own house came into view, small and unassuming, yet brimming with memories he was afraid to confront. He parked and took a deep breath, letting the quiet of the neighborhood settle around him. When he stepped out and shut the door behind him, the sudden stillness was overwhelming. The key turned easily in the lock, and as he entered, the musty air greeted him. Dust motes floated in the beams of the setting sun, dancing lazily as if time had frozen in his absence. He set his duffel down in the hall, his eyes sweeping over the familiar yet disconcertingly foreign surroundings. The old leather couch was still there, but the throw pillows Lily had once picked out were missing. The shelves, once overflowing with her art projects and family photos, now bore only dust and silence. As he walked further into the house, each step seemed to stir the ghosts of their life together. He could still see Lily's little fort made of blankets and pillows near the window, her favorite reading corner where she would spend hours absorbed in fairy tales. He hesitated by the kitchen, and his heart squeezed as he saw her childish scribbles, still stuck to the refrigerator by faded magnets. A simple drawing, a stick figure of him and her holding hands, felt like a dagger to his chest. How many times had she thought of him, waiting for him to come home, just as he had promised? The sight of it made him clutch his phone, his thumb hovering over Sarah's number. They hadn't spoken in months. Their communication was strictly about Lily, facilitated through emails and lawyers. Each ring echoed painfully in the silent house. One ring, then another and another, until the call went to voicemail. Her pre-recorded message sounded lighthearted, a stark contrast to the frustration simmering within him. When the call disconnected, he felt the frustration clawing at his insides. He'd endured countless nights on duty, alone in hostile territory. Yet the solitude of this house was different, more painful, more real. With a final sigh, he set the phone down and pulled his gaze away from the memories that crowded in on him. He would rest tonight and see Lily in the morning. His alarm was already set for dawn, ensuring he'd be at Sarah's place early enough to spend the day with his daughter. As he lay on the couch, wrapping himself in the thin blanket Lily had once adored, he found himself staring at the ceiling, fighting sleep. Despite his body's exhaustion, his mind was a battlefield, an endless replay of worries and scenarios. The silence pressed down on him, and the house grew darker, colder. Eventually, he drifted off, though not without a lingering sense of unease. In the quiet depths of the night, as his mind finally stilled, one thought cut through the fog of his dreams. He had kept his promise to come back, but at what cost? Discovery of Lily's condition. Ryan awoke before dawn, the quiet ticking of the clock, the only sound in the otherwise silent house. A gray light seeped through the windows, casting long shadows across the room and adding to the cold emptiness that had settled within him. He rose, his movements instinctive and methodical, each gesture a deliberate preparation for the day ahead. He checked his reflection briefly in the hallway mirror. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, the strain of years of battle, both overseas and at home, etched deeply into his face. But he steeled himself. Today was for Lily, and she would see the father she remembered, not the weary man he saw in the mirror. He grabbed his keys and slipped into his truck, feeling the quiet anticipation throb within him as he drove through the empty streets. The soft pinks and golds of early morning painted the sky as he turned onto Sarah's street. The houses stood quiet and serene, the peaceful facades hiding the turbulence he felt within. When he reached Sarah's home, he parked and paused, his hands resting on the wheel. The two-story house was neat and carefully maintained, but to Ryan, it had always felt cold, lacking the warmth that made a place feel like home. He couldn't shake the sense of unease that crept over him as he walked up to the door. He knocked, a part of him hoping Sarah might open it, that maybe she'd greet him with a look of remorse or even some semblance of understanding. But there was no answer, just the faint, echoing sound of his knuckles against the wood. After a moment's hesitation, he remembered the hidden key, tucked under a loose floorboard on the porch, a measure they had once agreed on for emergencies. Retrieving it with careful fingers, he unlocked the door, the quiet click echoing ominously in the morning stillness. He pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the house he had once considered an extension of his own. Inside, the air was stale, as if it hadn't been ventilated in days. A familiar sense of dread crept up his spine as he looked around. Everything appeared superficially normal. Sarah's well-chosen decor, a tidy living room, and framed photos on the walls. But there was a sense of neglect, an emptiness that made his chest tighten. He moved quietly through the house, calling Lily's name in a soft, almost hesitant voice, his words dissolving into the silence. It was when he reached the stairs that he noticed something strange, a faint but unmistakable odor, like a mix of dust, sweat, and something sour. His heart beat faster as he followed the smell up to the second floor, feeling an icy grip on his stomach. As he neared Lily's room, the door slightly ajar, his breath caught in his throat. There, lying curled up on the floor beside her bed, was his daughter. She lay on her side, her small body wrapped in a thin, faded blanket that barely covered her. Her face, pale and shadowed, looked worn and exhausted, as if the innocence he remembered had been replaced by a quiet, haunting fatigue. Her usually bright hair was matted, strands clinging to her forehead, and her small frame seemed diminished, almost fragile. "Lily," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. The sight of her on the floor, like some unwanted possession cast aside, shattered something deep inside him. He reached out, his hand hovering just above her shoulder, afraid to touch her, to break the fragile stillness. At the sound of his voice, Lily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, squinting against the morning light as she looked up at him, confusion clouding her gaze. For a moment, she seemed not to recognize him, her brow furrowing as she tried to place the face in front of her. Then, slowly, recognition dawned, and her eyes filled with tears. "Dad?" she murmured, her voice cracked and weak, like she hadn't spoken in days. He pulled her gently into his arms, feeling the slightness of her frame, the sharpness of her shoulders and ribs pressing against his hands. She felt so small, so fragile. The faint scent of neglect clung to her, a mixture of dust and stale air that made his throat tighten. He held her, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fury. How had it come to this? How had she been left in this state? As she nestled against him, her arms weakly wrapping around his neck, he felt her tremble. He leaned back slightly to look at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "What happened, sweetheart?" he asked gently, though his voice was rough with emotion. Her eyes flickered downward, avoiding his gaze as her hands fidgeted with the edge of her blanket. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I guess. Mom and Mark. They don't want me around much." Her words struck him like a physical blow. He forced himself to keep his face calm, though his hands tightened around her shoulders protectively. They don't want you around," he repeated, struggling to keep the anger out of his voice. Lily gave a small nod, her eyes downcast. "They say I caused too much trouble. Tommy says I'm a burden. And Mom, she just agrees." Ryan's jaw clenched as he fought to contain his anger. The thought of his little girl, his bright, loving Lily, being told she was unwanted, unloved. It tore at him in a way he hadn't thought possible. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, feeling his own tears sting his eyes. "You're not a burden," he whispered fiercely, his voice trembling. "You're my daughter, and you deserve so much more than this." She sniffled, her small fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt. I don't know what I did wrong, Dad. They won't let me eat with them sometimes. And Tommy, he takes my things, my books, my drawings. He says I don't deserve them." Her words were fractured, each sentence slipping out as if she were afraid to voice them, as if saying them would make them more real. Ryan's heart ached with a mixture of sorrow and rage, but he kept his voice soft, soothing, not wanting to frighten her. "None of this is your fault, Lily," he assured her, stroking her hair. "None of it. And you don't have to stay here anymore. I'm taking you with me, okay?" Her eyes widened in surprise, her gaze filled with a cautious hope that broke his heart all over again. "Really? Really?" He smiled, though his voice shook. "You're coming home with me, and I'll make sure you're safe. Always." She nodded, her relief palpable as she leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. He held her for a long moment, letting the weight of her trust settle over him. For the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would fight for her, no matter what it took. Gently, he helped her stand, noting the way she wobbled slightly, her body weakened by days, perhaps even weeks of neglect. His arms remained steady around her as he led her out of the house, his footsteps firm and determined as they left behind the darkness that had shadowed her life for too long. In the car, he wrapped her in an old blanket he kept in the trunk, its familiar scent of home providing her a small comfort. She leaned back, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but a hint of peace finally settling over her face. He drove in silence, his mind racing with thoughts of the road ahead. Doctors, lawyers, counselors, anything and everything that could help her heal from the scars left by the neglect she had endured. When they arrived home, he led her inside, helping her settle onto the couch with the blanket tucked around her shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a hope he hadn't seen in a long time. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. He knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing her hair back from her face. "I'm here now, Lily, and I won't leave you again. That's a promise." As she closed her eyes, drifting into a peaceful sleep, Ryan sat beside her, his heart filled with a fierce resolve. Whatever it took, he would protect her. The battles he had faced in the past were nothing compared to the fight that lay ahead. He watched over her as she slept, feeling a surge of love and determination. Lily was his little girl, and he would ensure she never felt alone, unloved, or unwanted again. Confrontation with Sarah. Ryan had spent the morning watching over Lily, unable to tear himself away from the couch where she lay sleeping. He marveled at how peaceful she looked. The weight of her recent experiences lifted momentarily as she drifted in a deep, restorative sleep. Her breaths were even, her face softened, and for the first time since his return, Ryan allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Yet beneath that hope simmered an anger he could barely contain. His phone lay on the table beside him, Sarah's name glowing on the screen with the unanswered texts she'd sent the night before. She hadn't noticed Lily was gone until morning. In each message, she demanded answers, the tone shifting from impatient to frantic, accusing him of taking their daughter without consent. The final message read, "Ryan, this is serious. Answer me." Ryan's jaw clenched as he considered his next move. He wouldn't simply tell her over a message. He needed to look her in the eyes, to see her reaction when he asked her to explain what he'd discovered. He needed answers, and he needed them now. When Lily stirred, blinking sleepily and smiling up at him, he felt his resolve harden. This was for her. "Lily," he said gently, brushing a hand over her hair, "I need to go speak with your mom, but I won't be long. I promise." A flicker of worry crossed her face, and she sat up slightly, still cocooned in the blanket. Are you bringing me back there?" Her voice was small, hesitant, filled with a fear that tugged painfully at his heart. "No, sweetheart. You're safe here with me," he assured her, squeezing her hand. "I'm just going to talk to her, okay? I'll be back before you know it." She nodded, her relief palpable, though a hint of worry remained in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring smile, then rose and grabbed his keys, his expression hardening as he stepped out the door. As he drove across town, his thoughts raced, replaying every detail Lily had shared with him. Each memory sharpened his anger until he reached Sarah's house, barely able to contain the fury within him. He parked, took a deep breath, and tried to steady himself. This confrontation wasn't just about anger. It was about protecting his daughter, about uncovering the truth. He climbed the porch steps, and this time, he knocked firmly on the door. Moments later, the door swung open to reveal Sarah, her face pale, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. She looked both relieved and defensive at the sight of him, her posture rigid, a forced calmness masking her irritation. "Ryan," she began, her voice tight with impatience. "What's going on? Why did you take Lily?" He met her gaze squarely, his expression unreadable. "I took her because I found her lying on the floor in her room." She looked half-starved, Sarah. He could barely keep his voice steady as he spoke. She was freezing, curled up under a blanket with no one around. "Can you explain that to me?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, or maybe regret. But just as quickly, she masked it with an incredulous expression. "She's exaggerating, Ryan. She always has been dramatic." "You know that," she replied, folding her arms defensively. "And it's not like you've been here." You don't know what it's like to raise a teenager on your own." He took a step closer, his voice low but filled with restrained fury. "I know my daughter," he said, "and I know what it looks like when someone's been neglected. She told me about Tommy, how he mocks her, how he takes her things and tells her she's not wanted. She told me about being locked in the attic, denied food, being treated like she's nothing more than an inconvenience to you and Mark." Sarah's face drained of color, her defensive posture faltering as she glanced away. But she recovered quickly, shaking her head with forced indignation. "Ryan, you don't understand the full situation. Lily can be difficult. She refuses to listen. She acts out. And Mark, well, he's just trying to instill some discipline. It's not abuse. It's just tough love." "Tough love," Ryan repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper, each word laced with disbelief. "That's what you're calling it? Letting your daughter sleep on the floor, starving her, making her feel like she's unwanted. That's not discipline, Sarah. That's abuse." A flicker of frustration crossed her face, her lips pressing together as she glanced around the empty room, as if searching for words. "Ryan, you don't know what it's like to balance everything. Mark's son, Tommy, he's a handful too. And Lily she just doesn't fit in. She refuses to adapt. She makes things difficult for everyone. And as for the attic, she was only sent there when she needed to cool down." Ryan shook his head, a cold anger settling in his chest. "She's a child, Sarah. She's been trying to make sense of everything, to find her place in a family that's treated her like an outsider. And instead of being her mother, you've let Mark and Tommy break her spirit." Sarah's face flushed with anger, her hands clenching into fists. "How dare you judge me, Ryan? You weren't here. You were off in another country, leaving us to pick up the pieces. Don't come back now and act like you're some kind of hero. I may have been away, but I never abandoned her," he replied, his voice hard and unyielding. "I've always loved her, always wanted what's best for her. But you've let her down in every way possible." For a moment, they stood in silence, their gazes locked, each filled with years of resentment, hurt, and anger. Ryan felt a bitter satisfaction as he watched her face shift, her confidence faltering. She knew, deep down, that he was right, but her pride refused to admit it. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice quiet but laced with desperation. "What are you going to do, Ryan?" "I'm taking Lily with me," he replied firmly. "And I'm going to make sure she's safe. I'm filing for custody, Sarah, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she never has to set foot in this house again." Her eyes widened, a mix of anger and fear flashing across her face. "You can't do that. You don't have the right." "I have every right as her father," he shot back. "And after what I've seen, I'm not letting her suffer another day under this roof." Her expression hardened, her jaw set as she glared at him. "You're going to fight me in court. Over her." "Over her, and over what's right," he replied without hesitation. "And trust me, I'll do everything in my power to make sure you and Mark don't get near her again." She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "You've said enough, Sarah. I don't want to hear your excuses. I'm done. Lily deserves better than this, and I'm going to make sure she gets it." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the house, leaving her standing in stunned silence. He didn't look back, didn't allow himself a moment's hesitation. Every step he took was filled with purpose, each one bringing him closer to the future he was determined to secure for Lily. As he reached his truck and climbed in, he felt a surge of relief mixed with a fierce resolve. The road ahead would be difficult, he knew that. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that would truly make a difference. When he returned home, he found Lily waiting on the couch, her eyes lighting up as he walked through the door. She looked at him with a hopeful, trusting gaze, one that filled him with both pride and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Are you back?" she asked softly. "I'm back," he replied, sitting beside her and pulling her into a gentle embrace. "And I'm here to stay. We're going to figure this out together, Lily. No one is going to hurt you ever again." She nestled against him, and he felt her relax in his arms, a quiet peace settling over them. For the first time in years, he felt like a father again, and he vowed to himself that he would never let her down. No matter what it took, he would fight for her, protect her, and give her the life she deserved. As he held her, he let himself dream of a future where she could grow up free from fear, surrounded by the love and security she had been denied for far too long. And in that moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to make that dream a reality. Building the case for Lily. The morning sun poured through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow over the table where Ryan and Lily sat, sharing a quiet breakfast. The peaceful stillness was a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within him as he considered the road ahead. The thought of court, of going toe-to-toe with Sarah in a battle for custody, was daunting. Yet every time he looked at Lily, with her slight, hopeful smile and the cautious brightness in her eyes, he knew there was no choice. He would do anything to protect her. After breakfast, he called James Reynolds, an old friend and trusted lawyer who had once helped him with his estate planning before deployment. James had built a reputation for taking on tough custody cases, especially those involving child protection, and Ryan knew he was the man for the job. Within an hour, they had set a meeting, and Ryan felt a flicker of relief amidst his worries. "Are we going somewhere?" Lily asked, watching him gather his things with a hint of trepidation. Ryan knelt beside her, brushing a hand over her hair. "Just for a bit, sweetheart. I'm meeting with a friend who's going to help us. You'll be safe here. I won't be long." She nodded, though her fingers tightened slightly around his hand. "Okay, Dad." He gave her a reassuring smile, then kissed her forehead before heading out the door. As he drove through town, he mentally rehearsed everything he planned to discuss with James. He needed to stay focused, to think clearly and rationally, but his heart was heavy with the memories of what Lily had endured, and his mind replayed the words she had whispered to him. The cruel taunts, the constant belittling, the feeling of abandonment. Each memory only strengthened his resolve. When he arrived at James's office, the familiar setting brought a sense of calm. The small law firm was quiet, with shelves lined with legal volumes and framed certificates adorning the walls. James greeted him with a firm handshake and a look of compassion. "Ryan, it's good to see you again," James said, his voice steady and kind, though his expression was serious. "I just wish it were under better circumstances." Ryan nodded, sinking into the leather chair across from James's desk. "I need your help, James. I want to file for full custody of my daughter. She's been through things no child should ever face. I can't let her go back to that house." James leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. "I understand. Let's start with everything you know, every detail, every incident. We'll need a complete picture to build a strong case." Ryan took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began. He recounted everything he knew, from the smallest details of Lily's behavior to the stories she'd shared about life with Sarah and Mark. He described the neglect, the emotional abuse, and the physical conditions he had found her in. As he spoke, he felt the anger and sorrow building within him, his hands clenching into fists. James listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, but mostly allowing Ryan to speak freely. When Ryan finally finished, the weight of his words seemed to hang in the room, a stark reminder of the battles that lay ahead. "This is more serious than I thought," James said, his tone grave. "Neglect and emotional abuse are difficult to prove in court, especially without physical evidence. But given what you've described, it sounds like Lily has been through a sustained period of mistreatment. We can make a strong case, but we'll need corroborating evidence, medical records, witness testimonies, and any documentation that shows a pattern of neglect." Ryan nodded, his determination unwavering. "Whatever it takes, James. I'll do anything to make sure she's safe." Good, James replied, pulling out a file folder and placing it on the desk between them. We'll need to start with a medical evaluation. A doctor's report can provide essential evidence of malnutrition or any other physical signs of neglect. I can arrange an appointment with a pediatrician who specializes in these cases. They'll be able to document any signs that support your claims. Ryan swallowed, a knot of worry forming in his stomach. The idea of Lily undergoing an examination, of having her body scrutinized for evidence of the abuse she had endured, was painful. But he knew it was necessary. If they were to build a case, they needed every piece of evidence they could gather. What about her teachers or neighbors? James continued, tapping his pen thoughtfully. Anyone who might have noticed signs of her mistreatment. Ryan thought for a moment. Her old teacher, Mrs. Allen, might have seen something. Lily mentioned she used to confide in her before Sarah limited their contact. And there's a neighbor, Mrs. Conway. She's known our family for years. I can reach out to them. James nodded approvingly. That's a good start. I'll draft letters requesting their statements. They'll need to be willing to testify in court if this goes to trial. Ryan's stomach twisted at the thought of a trial, of dragging Lily through a legal battle. But he knew there was no other way. This was the fight he had to face if he wanted to keep her safe. What about Lily's testimony? He asked, his voice hesitant. Would she have to speak in court? James hesitated, his expression sympathetic. In most cases, children aren't required to testify, especially if there's sufficient evidence. But if necessary, we may need her to provide a statement. We'll cross that bridge if we come to it. Ryan nodded, though the thought of Lily reliving her experiences was a painful one. He could still see the haunted look in her eyes, the way her voice had trembled as she recounted the cruel treatment she had faced. He didn't want her to endure that again, but he would do whatever it took to protect her. James slid a document across the desk. This is the petition for temporary custody. It will allow you to retain custody while we gather evidence and prepare for a full hearing. We'll file it immediately, and I'll request an emergency hearing based on the severity of Lily's situation. Ryan picked up the pen, his hand steady as he signed the document. Each stroke of ink felt like a step forward, a promise to himself and to Lily that he would see this through. As he finished signing, James reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ryan, I've handled cases like this before. It's going to be difficult, and there will be setbacks. But I believe in your case, and I believe in you. Lily is lucky to have a father who is willing to fight for her. Ryan nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for his friend's support. Thank you, James. I won't let her down. When he returned home later that afternoon, he found Lily in the living room, her sketchbook open on her lap. She looked up as he entered, a hesitant smile on her face. Did you talk to the person who's going to help us? She asked, her voice soft. He nodded, sitting beside her and placing an arm around her shoulders. I did. We're going to see a doctor tomorrow, just to make sure you're healthy. It's part of how we're going to keep you safe. Her expression clouded with worry. A doctor? Is that really necessary? It is, he replied gently. But I'll be with you the whole time. You won't have to do this alone. She nodded, though her brow remained furrowed. He pulled her closer, feeling the familiar ache in his chest as he thought of all she had endured. But there was also a sense of relief, a sense that they were finally taking steps toward a better future. The next day, they arrived at Dr. Meyer's office, a small but welcoming clinic tucked away on the edge of town. The pediatrician, a woman with warm eyes and a gentle manner, greeted them with a reassuring smile. Lily, I'm Dr. Myers, she said, crouching down to Lily's eye level. We're just going to do a few simple checks today, okay? Nothing scary, I promise. Lily nodded, her gaze flickering nervously to Ryan, who gave her an encouraging nod. He stayed by her side, holding her hand as Dr. Myers performed the examination. He felt his heart clench each time she noted a sign of malnutrition or commented on her low weight. Each observation was another reminder of the neglect she had faced, but it also served as evidence that would strengthen their case. When the examination was over, Dr. Myers sat down with them, her expression serious. "I'm glad you brought her in, Mr. Lewis. There are signs of malnutrition, as well as indications of chronic stress. I'll document everything and send a report to your lawyer." Ryan thanked her, feeling a surge of gratitude for her professionalism and compassion. He knew that each piece of evidence brought them one step closer to securing Lily's safety. As they left the clinic, Ryan felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The fight was only beginning, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance. Back at home, he tucked Lily into bed, sitting beside her as she drifted off to sleep. He watched her for a long moment, his heart swelling with both love and determination. He had always been willing to fight for his country, to face any danger in the line of duty. But now, his greatest mission was here at home, in the quiet safety of this house, with the daughter he had promised to protect. The evidence was in place. The wheels of the legal process were turning, and he knew there was no going back. He would face any obstacle, overcome any challenge, to give Lily the life she deserved. The battle ahead was daunting, but for her, he would see it through. As he sat in the quiet of the house, he let himself imagine the future, a future where Lily could grow up in safety, surrounded by love. It was a vision that filled him with both hope and purpose, and in that moment, he knew he would stop at nothing to make it a reality. The courtroom battle. The day of the custody hearing dawned with a heavy, oppressive stillness, the early light creeping through the windows of Ryan's home, casting faint shadows on the walls. Ryan barely slept the night before, every hour filled with a silent tension that weighed on him like armor. Today, everything would come to a head. The truth would be laid bare, and Lily's future would be decided by a judge, a stranger who held the power to shape their lives. Lily was quiet as she ate breakfast, the usual spark in her eyes dampened by worry. She hadn't asked many questions about the court proceedings, but he knew the concept scared her. He could see it in the way her shoulders were hunched and her gaze kept flickering towards him, seeking silent reassurance. "Dad," she whispered as they finished breakfast, her small voice breaking the silence. Are they going to make me go back there?" Ryan's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. He knelt beside her, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart," he replied firmly, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "We're going to tell the truth today. And the truth is, you belong here. You belong with me. I won't let them take you back there." She nodded, her lips pressed into a determined line, as if steeling herself for what lay ahead. In that moment, he saw her strength, the resilience that had kept her going despite everything she had faced. She was strong, and he was endlessly proud of her. When they arrived at the courthouse, the building loomed tall and imposing against the pale morning sky, its stone facade stern and unyielding. Ryan held Lily's hand as they walked up the steps, her small fingers clutching his tightly. The air was filled with the muffled hum of voices and footsteps, people milling about with purpose. But for Ryan, the world seemed to narrow to a single point of focus, protecting his daughter. Inside, they met with James, who stood by the courtroom doors, his face calm but serious. He gave Ryan a firm handshake and knelt to greet Lily with a gentle smile. "Are you ready, Lily?" James asked, his voice warm and reassuring. She nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the floor. James looked up at Ryan, giving him a reassuring nod. "We've got everything we need. The evidence is solid. All you need to do is tell the truth." The courtroom was quiet as they entered, the polished wood benches empty save for a few scattered spectators and court officials. Ryan's heart pounded as he took his seat at the front, Lily sitting close beside him. Across the room sat Sarah and Mark, their expressions tense and defensive. Sarah wouldn't meet his eyes, but Mark's gaze was cold and calculating, his mouth set in a tight line. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and a piercing gaze, entered the room and took her seat, calling the hearing to order with a firm rap of her gavel. She wasted no time, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she addressed the parties before her. "This hearing is to determine the custody arrangements for Miss Lily Lewis," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "The petitioner, Mr. Ryan Lewis, seeks full custody, citing neglect and abuse by the respondents, Sarah and Mark Thompson. We will hear evidence from both sides before a decision is made." James stood, his presence calm and authoritative, as he began to present their case. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and steady, "my client, Ryan Lewis, is here to protect his daughter from a household where she has suffered physical neglect and emotional abuse. The evidence will show a sustained pattern of mistreatment, which has left Lily in a fragile physical and emotional state. We ask that the court recognize Mr. Lewis's commitment to his daughter's well-being and grant him full custody." The judge nodded, and James called the first witness, Dr. Myers, the pediatrician who had examined Lily. Dr. Myers took the stand, her calm demeanor conveying a sense of professionalism and empathy. "Dr. Myers," James began, "could you please share your findings from your examination of Lily?" Dr. Myers nodded, adjusting her glasses as she looked directly at the judge. "When I examined Lily, I found signs consistent with malnutrition, as well as indications of chronic stress. Her weight was significantly below average for her age, and she displayed signs of emotional distress, including heightened anxiety." James handed her a document. "Are these your findings, Doctor?" She nodded, confirming her report's details with a steady voice. "Yes, they are. Based on my assessment, Lily's condition is consistent with a prolonged period of neglect. This is not a sudden issue. It appears to have been ongoing." The judge listened intently, nodding occasionally as she took notes. Ryan felt a surge of gratitude for Dr. Myers, for her calm and professional delivery of the truth. When it was Sarah's lawyer's turn to question Dr. Myers, he attempted to downplay her findings, suggesting that perhaps Lily's condition was due to picky eating or personal struggles unrelated to her home environment. But Dr. Myers remained composed, her responses clear and unwavering. "I've treated many children, and I know the signs of neglect," she replied firmly. "Lily's condition is not typical for a child simply going through a difficult phase." Ryan watched Sarah's face as the doctor spoke, hoping to see some glimmer of remorse. But her gaze was distant, her expression closed off, as if she had already distanced herself from the reality of her daughter's suffering. The next witness was Mrs. Allen, Lily's former teacher. Ryan's heart swelled with gratitude when he saw her take the stand, her kind eyes flickering briefly to him and Lily. She was a woman in her 60s with graying hair and a warm, motherly demeanor that had always comforted Lily. "Mrs. Allen," James began, "can you tell the court about your observations of Lily during the school year?" Mrs. Allen nodded, her voice soft but steady. Lily was a bright, curious girl, always eager to learn and make friends. But as time went on, I noticed changes. She became quieter, more withdrawn. She seemed tired, distracted. I reached out to her mother, Sarah, to express my concerns, but she was dismissive, insisting that Lily was simply going through a phase. James approached her, his tone gentle. "Did Lily ever confide in you about her situation at home?" Mrs. Allen's gaze softened as she glanced at Lily. "Yes, she did. She mentioned that she felt unwanted, like she didn't belong. She told me about her stepbrother taking her things and her mother siding with him. I tried to offer her support, but she began missing more days of school, and her mother wouldn't respond to my calls." Ryan's hands tightened into fists as he listened, each word a painful reminder of how Lily had suffered, how she had tried to reach out for help, only to be ignored. Finally, James presented the recorded audio files, the cruel comments from Mark and Tommy filling the courtroom. Every cutting word, every dismissive laugh echoed in the silence, painting a picture of the hostility Lily had endured. Ryan glanced at the judge, watching her face as she listened. Her expression remained neutral, but he saw the brief flicker of disgust in her eyes as Mark's voice boomed through the speakers, calling Lily a burden. When the recording ended, The silence in the courtroom was heavy, the air thick with tension. Ryan risked a glance at Sarah, hoping that the audio might have shaken her, but she sat stiffly, her expression stony, refusing to look at him. The judge addressed Sarah's lawyer, who called her to the stand. Sarah walked up, her movements stiff and defensive. As she took her seat, her lawyer began questioning her, leading her to portray herself as a struggling mother trying to balance the needs of a blended family. Raising Lily was challenging, she explained, her voice tinged with resentment. She resisted every rule, every bit of structure. Mark and I did our best, but she wouldn't adapt. James rose to cross-examine her, his questions calm but unyielding. Mrs. Thompson, can you explain why Lily reported being denied food and access to her belongings? Sarah faltered, her gaze hardening. Lily has always been dramatic. She made things up for attention. We didn't deny her anything. We just had rules that she needed to follow. James pressed further. And what about the audio recordings, Mrs. Thompson? The conversations where your husband and son belittled her, mocked her. Sarah looked away, her jaw set. I didn't know about those conversations. I didn't hear them. They were probably just trying to get her to behave. James's voice grew firmer. So you're saying that allowing her to be treated as an outsider, to be mocked and denied basic comforts, was simply part of discipline? Sarah's lips tightened, her eyes flashing with anger. You wouldn't understand. You weren't there. The judge's gavel rapped sharply, bringing the courtroom back to order. Her gaze was steely as she regarded Sarah. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. You may step down. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone took their seats, the weight of the testimonies and evidence hanging heavily in the air. The judge took a long pause, her gaze sweeping over the room as she organized her thoughts. Having reviewed the evidence presented, she began, her voice calm but firm. I am deeply troubled by the accounts and documentation provided by Dr. Myers, Mrs. Allen, and the recorded audio. The evidence indicates a pattern of neglect and emotional mistreatment that no child should have to endure. Ryan's heart pounded, his grip on Lily's hand tightening as he waited for the judge's decision. In light of this evidence, I find it in the best interest of Lily Lewis that her father, Ryan Lewis, be granted full custody, she declared, her tone final. Effective immediately, Sarah Thompson is to have no contact with Lily until further review. This court will also investigate potential criminal charges of neglect and abuse on the part of Mark Thompson. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Ryan felt a surge of relief wash over him, his vision blurring as he looked down at Lily, who was staring up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Does this mean I can stay with you? She whispered, her voice filled with hope. Yes, sweetheart, he replied, pulling her into a tight embrace. You're safe. You're with me now, and no one can take you away. As they left the courtroom, hand in hand, Ryan felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of peace. For the first time, he knew that they had won, truly won. The darkness that had shadowed Lily's life was finally behind them, and the path forward was bright and filled with hope. The battle had been long, and it had taken everything he had, but it was worth it. Lily was safe, and together they would build a new life, a life filled with love, laughter, and the warmth of a true home. New beginnings. The days after the court hearing unfolded like a breath of fresh air, each morning brighter than the last as Ryan and Lily adjusted to a life finally free of fear and uncertainty. For the first time in years, Ryan felt an immense lightness, a sense of peace that he had almost forgotten was possible. His daughter was safe, and they had been given the chance to start anew. On the first morning in their new life, Ryan woke early, feeling the warm glow of the sun streaming through the kitchen windows. He busied himself in the kitchen, preparing Lily's favorite breakfast, pancakes with fresh strawberries and whipped cream. The smell of sizzling batter filled the air, and he couldn't help but smile as he thought of the small traditions they would begin to create together. Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She wore an oversized shirt of his, her hair tousled, and a shy smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Morning, Dad," she murmured, still adjusting to the comfort of being able to greet him each morning. "Good morning, sweetheart," he replied, his voice warm with affection. "I thought we'd celebrate our first day with a proper breakfast. What do you think?" Her face lit up, a genuine smile breaking through. "Pancakes. Really?" "Of course. Only the best for my girl." He chuckled, ruffling her hair as he plated the pancakes, stacking them high and topping them with whipped cream and strawberries. She sat at the table, her eyes wide with delight, as he set the plate in front of her. They ate together, sharing stories from their pasts, simple, happy memories that reminded them both of better times. Lily seemed to come alive as she talked, her voice animated as she recalled the small adventures they'd had, like building forts in the living room and camping out under a blanket of stars in the backyard. Ryan listened, his heart swelling with pride and love, grateful for each moment that strengthened their bond. After breakfast, they decided to go for a walk in the nearby park. It was a bright, crisp day, and the trees were beginning to show the golden hues of early autumn. Lily reached for his hand as they walked, her fingers small and warm in his, a silent gesture of trust that filled him with an overwhelming sense of purpose. They stopped by the pond, watching the ducks glide across the water, their reflections rippling in the gentle waves. Lily looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. Do you think everything will be okay now?" she asked quietly, her eyes filled with both hope and a lingering uncertainty. He knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Yes, Lily. It'll take time, but things will get better. We'll work through it together, one day at a time. I promise." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she seemed to believe him fully, the fear that had shadowed her gaze beginning to melt away. In the following weeks, they settled into a steady rhythm. Ryan began working from home, ensuring he was always nearby to support Lily as she adjusted. He contacted her school, working closely with her teachers to ease her transition and give her a chance to catch up on missed assignments without overwhelming her. He found that the simple acts of creating structure and stability for her brought a sense of peace to both of them, an unspoken reminder that they were building a future together. As the days passed, small signs of Lily's recovery became more visible. She laughed more often, her eyes sparkling with a joy that hadn't been there before. She began filling her sketchbook with new drawings, vibrant, hopeful images of flowers, animals, and scenes of nature that reflected her blossoming spirit. Ryan kept each drawing, proudly displaying them on the refrigerator, a gallery of her healing and growth. One evening, as he was putting away the dishes, Lily came up to him, clutching a drawing in her hand. She hesitated for a moment, her cheeks flushing as she held it out to him. "I made this for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He took the drawing, his breath catching as he looked at it. She had drawn the two of them standing side by side, their hands clasped, with a bright, colorful sky above them, and flowers blooming all around. Above the picture, she had written in careful letters, "Home." He felt a lump in his throat as he looked down at her, his heart swelling with pride and love. "This is beautiful, Lily. Thank you. I'll treasure it forever." She smiled, her eyes shining with a quiet pride, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, each silently acknowledging the unbreakable bond that had grown between them. As they settled into the comfort of their new life, Ryan took steps to ensure Lily had the support she needed. He arranged for her to see a counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Harper, who specialized in helping children recover from trauma. Lily was nervous at first, but Dr. Harper's gentle approach slowly helped her open up, and Ryan saw her begin to release the emotional weight she had been carrying. One afternoon, after a session with Dr. Harper, Lily sat with Ryan in the living room, her face thoughtful as she picked at the edge of a pillow. "Dad?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Dr. Harper, she said that it's okay to talk about the things that hurt me." That it's good to let them out. Ryan nodded, his expression gentle. That's right, sweetheart. You don't have to keep it all inside. You can share anything with me, and I'll always be here to listen. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. Sometimes, I still feel like I'm in that house, like they're still telling me I don't belong, that I'm not wanted. Her words pierced his heart, but he kept his expression calm, his hand resting on her shoulder in a steadying gesture. Lily, you're wanted. You're loved. Every single day, I'm grateful that you're here with me. You're my family, and nothing will ever change that. She nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek as she leaned against him. Thank you, Dad. I love you. I love you too, Lily. Always. In the months that followed, their lives blossomed with quiet joy. They built new routines, weekend trips to the farmer's market, lazy Sunday mornings with pancakes and cartoons, and peaceful evenings spent reading together by the fire. Each day brought new memories, small moments of happiness that filled their home with warmth and laughter. Ryan also began working on a project he had always dreamed of, transforming their backyard into a garden. He and Lily spent afternoons planting flowers and vegetables, their hands dirty with soil and their hearts light with laughter. The garden became a sanctuary, a symbol of their growth and resilience, a place where they could watch their efforts bloom under the care and love they poured into it. One sunny afternoon, as they worked side by side, Lily looked up at him, her face flushed with happiness. I think I finally feel like I belong," she said, her voice filled with a quiet confidence. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You do, Lily. You always have. They planted the last of the flowers together, their hands entwined in the soil as they pressed the roots into the earth. As they stood back to admire their work, the garden seemed to glow with life, a living testament to the journey they had taken together. On the anniversary of the court decision, Ryan and Lily marked the day with a small celebration, a quiet dinner filled with laughter and gratitude. As they sat together, Lily reached across the table, her hand clasping his. "Thank you for fighting for me, Dad," she said, her eyes shining with emotion. He looked at her, his heart swelling with pride and love. "I'd do it all over again, 1,000 times. You're worth every fight, every challenge." They clinked their glasses, a silent toast to the life they had built together, a life filled with love, hope, and the unbreakable strength of family. As the night drew to a close, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars twinkle in the clear, dark sky. Ryan wrapped an arm around Lily's shoulders, pulling her close, feeling the warmth of her presence beside him. For the first time in a long time, Ryan felt whole, complete. The darkness of the past was behind them, replaced by the steady light of a new beginning. He knew there would still be challenges, moments of doubt and fear, but they would face them together, side by side. And as he looked down at Lily, her face serene and her eyes filled with peace, he knew with certainty that they had found their way home, finding her place. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow over the table as Lily sat, anxiously stirring her cereal. Ryan watched her from across the table, noting the slight frown that creased her forehead and the way she twisted the spoon absently in her fingers. "Are you nervous about going back to school?" he asked gently, his tone calm but encouraging. Lily nodded, chewing her lip as she glanced up at him. "A little. I don't know if people will remember me, or if they'll even want to." Ryan leaned forward, offering her a reassuring smile. "Remember, Lily, this is a fresh start. Just be yourself. You're a great kid, and I'm sure your classmates will see that. And if you ever feel overwhelmed, just know I'm here." Her expression softened, and she gave a small nod, her fingers relaxing around the spoon. She looked down at her cereal, taking a deep breath as if gathering her courage. The past few months had been a process of rediscovery for her, a slow journey of reclaiming the confidence that had been worn down by years of neglect and mistreatment. But school was a different challenge entirely. It was a place full of unknowns, where she would need to trust herself and believe in her own worth. As they walked out to the car, Ryan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, and she smiled up at him, her expression a mixture of apprehension and hope. The drive to school was quiet, the early morning light casting a gentle glow over the streets, as if to remind them both that this was a new beginning. When they reached the school, Ryan pulled into the drop-off lane, and Lily took a deep breath, clutching her backpack tightly. "Good luck, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady with pride. "I'll be right here to pick you up after school." She nodded, her smile shy but determined. "Thanks, Dad." As she stepped out of the car and walked toward the school entrance, Ryan watched her, his heart swelling with both pride and protectiveness. She looked small yet resilient, a young girl facing a world that had not always been kind to her. But today, she was stepping forward with courage, and that alone was a victory. Inside the school, Lily felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety as she walked through the bustling hallways. She clutched the schedule her teacher had given her, glancing at the classroom members as she made her way to her homeroom. The familiar sounds of laughter and chatter surrounded her, and she felt a pang of nostalgia, a longing for the simplicity she had once known before her world had become so complicated. When she reached her classroom, she took a deep breath and stepped inside. The teacher, Mrs. Perry, greeted her with a warm smile, and Lily felt a surge of relief at the kindness in her eyes. "Lily, we're glad to have you back," Mrs. Perry said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "Why don't you take a seat over there by the window?" Lily nodded, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks as she made her way to the seat. She settled into her desk, glancing out the window at the sprawling playground beyond, where she had once played with her classmates. The room slowly filled with students, some of whom gave her curious glances, others who whispered to each other as they looked her way. She tried to ignore the quiet murmurs, focusing on the view outside and grounding herself with the steady rhythm of her breathing. As the bell rang and class began, Mrs. Perry introduced Lily to the class, her voice light and encouraging. "Everyone, this is Lily. Some of you may remember her from last year. Let's all make her feel welcome." A few students nodded, smiling shyly at her, and she gave a small, tentative smile in return. The rest of the morning passed smoothly, with lessons and group activities that distracted her from her nerves. By lunchtime, she was beginning to feel more comfortable, her heart beating with a sense of cautious optimism. In the cafeteria, she found an empty table near the window and sat down, unpacking her lunch and glancing around at the groups of students chatting and laughing together. She wondered if she would ever feel that comfortable again, if she would find a place among her classmates where she truly belonged. As she unwrapped her sandwich, a girl with curly hair and a bright smile approached her table, her tray balanced in one hand. "Hi, I'm Mia. Mind if I sit with you?" the girl asked, her tone friendly and open. Lily's eyes widened in surprise, and she quickly nodded. "Oh, sure. I'm Lily." Mia grinned as she set her tray down. "Yeah, I remember you from last year. You used to sit a few rows in front of me in math. It's great to see you back." Lily felt a flicker of happiness at Mia's enthusiasm, her nerves easing as they began to talk. Mia was outgoing and bubbly, effortlessly filling the silence with stories about her summer, her family, and her love for drawing. They discovered they both enjoyed art, and Lily felt a sense of kinship as Mia animatedly described her latest sketchbook project. As they laughed together over shared stories and silly jokes, Lily felt her heart lift, a warmth spreading through her that she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a simple, unremarkable moment, a lunchtime conversation with a new friend. But to Lily, it was everything. She felt seen, welcomed, and, for the first time, truly at ease. When she arrived home that afternoon, Ryan was waiting for her on the porch, his face lighting up as she ran to him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Dad, today was amazing," she exclaimed, her voice brimming with enthusiasm, as she recounted every detail of her day. The kindness of her teacher, the friendly smiles from her classmates, and most importantly, her new friend Mia. Ryan listened, his heart swelling with happiness as he watched her animated expression. "I'm so proud of you, Lily. I knew you'd find your place," he said, giving her a warm hug. Over the next few weeks, Lily settled into her new routine, growing more confident and comfortable with each passing day. She and Mia became inseparable, spending every lunch together and bonding over their shared love of art and storytelling. Lily often invited Mia over to their house after school, and they would spend hours drawing in the living room or playing outside in the backyard, their laughter filling the air. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch painting together, Mia looked over at Lily, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Lily, you're really strong," Maya said softly. "You went through a lot, and I think it's pretty amazing that you're here now, smiling and everything." Lily paused, her paintbrush hovering over the canvas as she considered Mia's words. She hadn't thought of herself as strong before. She had always felt small and vulnerable, defined by the hurt she had endured. But now, as she looked at the vibrant colors on her canvas and felt the warmth of her friend's words, she realized that strength wasn't just about being fearless. It was about finding the courage to keep going, even when the world felt dark. "Thanks, Mia," she said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "I don't feel strong all the time, but I'm trying." And in that moment, she understood that trying was enough. As the months went on, Ryan and Lily continued to build their life together, creating memories that filled their home with love and laughter. Every evening, they spent time in the garden, nurturing the flowers they had planted and watching them bloom, each petal a symbol of the resilience they had both cultivated. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat together by the fire, Lily looked up at her father, a question in her eyes. "Dad, do you think it's okay to feel happy again?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Ryan reached over, taking her hand in his expression filled with warmth and understanding. "Yes, Lily. You deserve every bit of happiness. You've been through so much, and now it's your time to live, to laugh, to love, and to feel safe. This is your home, and you are loved." Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of release, of finally allowing herself to embrace the love and peace that had been waiting for her. She leaned against him, her heart filled with gratitude for the life they had built, for the strength she had found within herself, and for the father who had never given up on her. In that moment, she knew she had found her place, not just in the world, but in her own heart. And as they sat together in the warmth of the fire, the gentle crackling of the flames filling the quiet, they knew that this was only the beginning of a life filled with love, hope, and endless new beginnings.